Okay, am I good? Fun fact, I was actually part of the group that did the traffic study that Dr. Nikolai just talked about. We didn't have construction workers watching us, but we do have a lovely drone footage that is there to show how stupid we looked for the rest of time. So good times there. Today I'm going to be talking about earthworm casting. I'm not going to talk about a specific study, but I'm just going to talk about casting as a whole and how we can control or attempt to control. Maybe I'll just use the computer. That'll be easier. Oh, is this the one? Maybe my fingers just aren't strong enough, you know? Oh, am I not? Oh, it's me. It's fine. Okay, so we're going to jump in with what I like to call know your enemy, because I think with any pest, it's important to kind of know what you're up against. I'm not going to go into as much detail as I normally would with this, just for time, but then we'll jump right into some options for control. Hopefully we'll have time for questions. Most of the time, this is what we think about when we think about earthworms in turf. We don't think of all the benefits, which I can talk to you all about later. We don't have time for that. But this is the issue, right? Earthworms often come up to the surface in turf to deposit their cast or their feces. Earthworms, depending on environmental conditions and the species and all of that, can ingest up to 30 times their weight in soil every single day, which might not sound like a lot if you think about like an individual earthworm, but if you have a lot of earthworms in your system, which you probably do, that's a significant amount of soil that's coming up every day, and I'm sure all of you have seen something similar. And this can cause a lot of issues, right? You get muddy, uneven playing surfaces, which golfers are going to be mad about. You get water retention in the canopy, which can lead to some disease issues. You get mower damage, as those casts can build up on reels. Not only does this damage the mower, but you often get reduced height of, or uneven height of cut with this. You get reduced light penetration into the turf and reduced photosynthesis, particularly if those casts are muddy and kind of smearing over the turf surface. You get reduced visual appeal, which depending on your stakeholders may or may not be an issue. And then you get pest invasion, as you have things like rodents and birds coming into that system looking for those earthworms to eat and causing a lot more damage themselves as well. Now, as far as anatomy and all of that, again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here like I normally would, but what we think is going on is that you can think of juvenile earthworms as kind of like a teenager going through a growth spurt, or puberty, or whatever you want to call it. They are going to be eating a ton of material trying to grow and get big and build that biomass, whereas the adults in the system are kind of moved on from that. They've entered that reproductive stage. They're not going to be eating as much material. And because those juveniles are eating a lot more material, they, of course, have to expel that material. And so you get a lot more casting with juveniles in the system. And you have a juvenile because they don't have the swollen band that you often see around earthworms. It's called a clitellum. It's a sign of sexual maturity. And that's how we know that we have adults or juveniles. Now, earthworms are hermaphrodites. Some of them actually can reproduce without a mate, but most of the time, you will see these two earthworms kind of move along one another. They latch on and will exchange sperm. They then secrete this like special mucus that slides off the body, and you get these cocoons. And this is probably the biggest issue that we're facing right now in control. These cocoons are resistant to desiccation and high temperatures and low temperatures. Even if you are going out, and I'm not saying anyone here is doing this, but if you are going out and spraying, insecticides or fungicides out there that might have secondary effects on earthworms, probably not penetrating these cocoons. And so often we'll see a buildup of a cocoon bank similar to kind of a weed seed bank in the soil. And those cocoons can last for many, 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 many years. So even if you eradicate all of the kind of what I would call living earthworms in your system, you probably still have cocoons there. They're going to hatch eventually, and your population is going to jump back up again. I'm going to talk about some preferred habitat. Just keep in mind that this is very, very generic and will vary depending on the species. But overall, earthworms prefer kind of what I would call a medium textured soil. If it's too heavy in that sand, there's the potential that it's going to be abrasive. You're reducing that moisture. You're reducing that organic matter in that system for them to feed on. On the flip side, if it's too heavy in clay, there's the potential that it's staying too wet. I'm sure many of us have seen earthworms come up to the surface after it rains, and that's because they breathe via diffusion. If all of those air pockets are full of water, there's no air for them to breathe. So medium textured soil, temperatures around 10 to 16 Celsius, which I think is like 50 to 58 or 60 Fahrenheit. Soil moisture around field capacity, soil pH slightly acidic to neutral. Unfortunately, a lot of this is also kind of ideal turf growing conditions, so unfortunate overlap there. Earthworms in general are pretty sensitive to salinity, and it's not that they won't be present in compacted soil, but earthworms vary in the way that they burrow and cast. Some of them will cast within the soil profile, so they aren't really pests in turf. But if that soil is compacted, there are no pockets for them to deposit those casts in, and so by necessity, they have to come up to the surface to deposit those casts. Now, we just talked about a lot of general information, but I do want to point out that not all earthworms are created equal. Like I said, they vary depending on the species of how they burrow, how they cast, all of that. And there's a huge variety of earthworms out there. You can see this little guy on Eric's finger here, a couple millimeters wide, maybe 1.5 centimeters long. This is an adult earthworm. This is probably what we think of or have more of a picture in our minds of when we think about earthworms. And then there's even these monsters out in the cloud forest of Ecuador. Thank goodness we don't have these on our turf, right? Those casts would be a different issue altogether. But just to show that there's a wide variety of earthworms out there, about 7,000 species estimated, and they're all going to react differently to different control measures as well. And before we get into control, I think it's important to think about how our worms are actually getting into the system. There's a lot of theories out there. One of those is compost. A lot of people will bring compost into their, some people use it in the turf, but more likely if you're bringing compost or even mulch into surrounding landscaped areas, so if you have gardening beds around the club, something like that, likely that you have some cocoons in that material or even some live worms, depending on the product. Sod, I've talked to a lot of superintendents that have sodded part of their course or their sports field or whatever the case may be, and immediately have an earthworm problem afterwards. Earthworms often deposit those cocoons right in that root zone, so in the first inch or two or so of that root zone or that soil. So particularly if you have soil-based sod, but even if you have wash sod, potentially bringing in some cocoons there. And then top dressing sand, which is kind of a catch-22 because we talk about top dressing as a potential control measure as well, and we'll get to that here in a second. But the idea being that people will go out fishing with their live bait. They don't use all of that live bait, so they dump it in the river. Then those earthworms go and reproduce and produce all these cocoons. We then dredge that river for top dressing sand. Those cocoons are still living through that dry down process. And then we go and spread all that sand all over our golf course. So potential issue there. If you go fishing with live bait, take it home and throw it away. If you don't use it, don't dump it in the river. Okay, what we're all actually interested in, how to manage. I'm going to just get it out there. I don't have like a silver bullet. There's not one thing that is legal that I can recommend that will eradicate your worms. So it's going to have to be kind of a step-by-step process. But the first thing I always say is if you have these really clear bands where you have a lot of casting, this is a research plot, but same idea here. See what's different about those bands. That's going to be a lot easier to fix these small areas than going wall to wall with a product when you only need to treat certain areas, right? So if you see something like this, get out with your moisture meter, see if it's a low-lying area that's a little bit more wet, see if there's differences in organic matter, see if that area is compacted, and then go from there. Often, though, we see something a little bit more like this, unfortunately, which is going to be a little bit more difficult to touch on. Some people look at removal of clippings, the idea being that you are removing that food source for the earthworms. You can try this. It's not my, I don't normally recommend it. Often in the research world, we see varied results, probably because if you remove that organic matter from that system, those earthworms still have to eat enough to get the same amount of nutrients, so they have to eat more material to get the same amount of organic matter and nutrients. So just something to keep in mind there. You could test it out. Maybe it works for you. We also have expellents, or have had expellents, depending on where you are these days. Historically, these have been Maura meal-based. More recently, they are tea seed oil-based. Dr. McGraw, who is actually here today, was looking at early bird in particular and saw about 3 to 4-ish weeks of, some control. You're not going to get rid of all the earthworms. But just keep in mind that this is a very labor-intensive process. There's a lot of worms that come up to the surface. It requires a lot of water. These can be toxic to fish, so you have to protect your waterways. So a lot of considerations there. You don't want to do this on a day when golfers are going to be on the course or anything. If they see this happening, they're going to be concerned. So again, make sure that you're protecting your waterways. As far as I'm aware, there are no saponins that are labeled for earthworm control, so do what you will with that information. And there are very few still in production. A lot of them, at least in the US, have been taken off the market. I don't know what the situation is here, but it's an option if you feel good about that. Top dressing, again, has been one of the more researched areas. Again, the idea being that that material is going to be abrasive, you're diluting that organic matter, reducing the moisture in theory. But again, this has had really inconsistent results. One thing I want to point out is the idea of the sand being abrasive is kind of hit or miss. In our research, we were using sub-randed sand. You can see that that's probably not going to irritate a soft-bodied earthworm as much as something that's like an angular or even a subangular. That's going to be a little bit more abrasive and irritating to that earthworm. And the species composition is also really important. Most turf has anywhere from 2 to 4 species on average, probably. It can go higher or lower. But what works for 1 or 2 probably isn't going to work for all of them. And so, again, this idea of mixing control measures is really important. One benefit, though, with top dressing and sand use is that you might be able to shift from something that's a little bit more muddy, that's going to smear across that surface, eventually getting to something more like this, where, yes, you still have the same amount of cast and the same frequency of casting, but that material is sandier and easier to brush back into that turf canopy, and you don't get the buildup on the mowers and things like that. You might dull your blades a little bit, but different issues there. Some other options. A lot of people will go out with a backpack or a buffalo blower before you mow. This can help dry out the cast, maybe a little bit, hopefully. Or if you're lucky, can actually blow the cast off. That would be great. So that's an option. Brushing or dragging. Again, this works best if that material is sandy. If you're going out with a cocoa mat and dragging that muddy cast all over the place, probably not the best option. You could just say, screw it and go out and mow anyway. That was my approach, but I was lucky enough to be able to do that. Or I know some people have looked at attaching brushes to the front of those mower reels to help brush that material in before you get out with those reels. So maybe that's something you look into. Aeration hasn't been researched as much, but I think this kind of case study shows a compelling picture. So this is a shared green. The right side was aerated back in early June. This was aerated in early August. And at the time of this picture, you can see there's a lot more cast 3 months past aeration, whereas 1 week after aeration, very little casting activity. So maybe this is something that you work into your rotation, or maybe just adjust your normal aeration schedule to when you historically have a lot of casting, and maybe it helps with that a little bit as well. I don't know for sure if this is on the horizon, and I am not suggesting that you go out and do this rogue, but there's one of the ways that we sample earthworms in earthworm research is electrocution. So you electrocute the soil, they come up to the surface. It doesn't work on all earthworms, but maybe some research coming soon. I'm not entirely sure on that. Hopefully in the next couple of years we'll know more. And if all else fails, you can always get an intern or a SAD grad student out with a vacuum to vacuum up those casts. It is very laborious, I can say from experience, but it does work. So an option there. If anyone's interested in this, I do have a paper that was out, 3 years ago now maybe. Of course, some of the saponin information is already outdated, even though it's a new paper. It's not open access, but if you are interested in this, it summarizes a lot of this as well as some more chemical control options. Shoot me an email, I'm happy to send you a PDF of that one. And with that, I don't know if I have time for questions. Yes, okay.
Thank you, Paige.